The slap echoed through the street. Sharp, loud, final for a split second. Everything froze. The traffic noise, the chatter, even the flashing red and blue lights seemed to pause. A uniformed police officer stood stiff, jaw clenched, hand still in the air from where it had just struck a man across the face. That man didn't stumble, didn't shout, didn't raise his voice. He simply turned his head back slowly. People nearby stared in disbelief. Someone gasped. Someone else whispered, "Did that really just happen?" The officer sneered. "Don't look at me like that," he snapped. "No one's above the law." The man he had slapped looked calm, too calm. No rage, no panic, just a quiet stillness. The kind that makes the air feel heavier. He straightened his jacket, wiped a small line of blood from the corner of his lip, and met the officer's eyes. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and steady. "You didn't need to do that." The officer laughed, a short, arrogant laugh. "You telling me how to do my job now?" The crowd grew thicker. Cars slowed. A few people started recording openly now. Everyone could feel it. This wasn't just another traffic stop. Something was wrong. The man took a slow breath. 5 minutes. That's all it took. 5 minutes from that slap. To screaming sirens. To shocked faces. To the same officer begging for help while hanging upside down. But right now, none of them knew that. Right now, all they saw was a calm man standing under flashing lights, facing an officer who thought control came from force. The officer stepped closer. Too close. "You think you're special?" he said. "You think I care who you are?" The man answered softly, almost sadly. "It's not about who I am." That was the moment several people in the crowd exchanged uneasy looks. Because there was something about him. The way he stood, the way he didn't flinch, the way he watched every movement, like someone who had been here before. Many times, one woman whispered, "Why isn't he scared?" Another said, "He looks familiar." The officer raised his voice again, trying to reassert dominance. What he didn't realize, what no one realized yet, was that the man he had just slapped was Steven Seagal. And the next 5 minutes would change everything. The street was still lit with flashing red and blue, but the night itself felt unusually quiet. It was just after midnight, that strange hour when the city hasn't decided whether it's done breathing or just holding its breath. A few bars were closing. Taxis rolled by slowly. Neon signs buzzed overhead like tired insects. The traffic stop hadn't seemed important at first. A single patrol car officer. One driver pulled over near the curb routine. The officer leaned against his cruiser, radio crackling softly at his shoulder. He was young, not fresh out of the academy, but not seasoned either. Confident enough to feel untouchable, loud enough to make sure people nearby noticed him. Authority, to him, wasn't something you carried quietly. It was something you displayed. The man who stepped out of the car didn't match the officer's expectations. No flashy clothes, no jewelry, no nervous movements, just jeans, a dark jacket worn at the edges, and a posture that felt deliberate. Not stiff, not relaxed, balanced. "Hands where I can see them," the officer barked. The man complied instantly. Slow movements, calm breathing. No resistance. Streetlights revealed his face in pieces. A strong jaw, tired eyes, lines that spoke of years rather than fear. He looked like someone who had lived through things most people only watched on screens. A small crowd had already begun to form. That always happened. Someone leaned out of a car window. 2 people exiting a bar paused. A delivery driver killed his engine and watched from across the street. The officer circled him like a shark testing the water. "You know why I pulled you over?" he asked. The man shook his head. "No, officer." His voice was steady, not submissive, not challenging. That seemed to irritate the officer more than silence would have. "You got a smart mouth," the officer said. "Because I don't like smart mouths, no," the man replied. "I just like clarity." A few people exchanged looks. The officer scoffed and stepped closer, invading his space. "License." The man reached toward his pocket slowly, deliberately. That's when the officer snapped. "Hey, I didn't say move. The man froze instantly. I'm stopping, he said calmly. You asked for my... The officer cut him off, chest-puffed, voice raised for the crowd. You don't tell me anything. You do exactly what I say, exactly when I say it. The man nodded once. I understand. But something in his eyes changed. Not anger, not fear. Awareness. The kind that comes from experience. The officer misread it completely. He leaned in closer, face inches away now. You think you're calm because people are watching. He sneered. You think that protects you? The man exhaled slowly. Officer, he said quietly. This doesn't need to go sideways. That sentence, calm, measured, landed like an insult. The officer laughed sharply. Sideways. He repeated, You threatening me? No, the man replied. I'm advising you. That was when the crowd felt it. That subtle shift in the air. One man muttered. Oh no. Another whispered. Why is he talking like that? The officer's jaw tightened. His hand flexed at his side. You don't advise me, he said. You don't warn me, you answer. The man met his eyes fully now. Then asked the right question. The officer's face flushed. Power challenged, even quietly. Feels like disrespect to the insecure. He raised his hand and slapped him. The sound cracked through the night. A woman gasped. Someone swore under their breath. A phone camera clicked on. The man turned his head with the force of it. Then slowly turned back. Silence fell heavy. The officer expected shouting, panic, submission. Instead, the man straightened himself. That, he said evenly, was unnecessary. The officer smiled, satisfied now. No one's above the law. What the officer didn't know, what no one in that growing crowd fully understood yet, was that the man standing calmly under those flashing lights was Steven Seagal. Not just an actor, not just a name, but someone who had spent decades studying control, discipline, and the exact consequences of losing both. And the night was only just beginning. After the slap, something changed, not in the man who'd been struck, but in everyone else. The crowd didn't move closer anymore. They stopped whispering. They just watched. The officer stood there for a moment, chest rising and falling, clearly satisfied with himself. To him, the slap wasn't violence. It was punctuation, a way of ending the conversation. You're done talking, he said. Now you listen. The man nodded slowly. I'm listening. That calm again. It unsettled the officer more than shouting ever could. He stepped back half a pace, hand drifting toward his belt. Not the weapon, not yet, but close enough to remind everyone who controlled the situation. Turn around, the officer ordered. Hands on the car. The man hesitated, not in refusal, but in thought. Officer, he said quietly. Before you do that, call your supervisor. The officer laughed out loud. Now you're making requests. I'm making a suggestion, the man replied. For your sake. That did it. The officer's face hardened. The laugh disappeared. You think you scare me? He snapped. You think because you took a hit without crying, you're tough. The man didn't answer immediately. He glanced briefly at the growing circle of onlookers. The bartender standing in the doorway, the couple holding hands across the street, the delivery driver still sitting in his idling van. Then he looked back at the officer. This doesn't end the way you think it does, he said. The officer stepped forward fast, shoving him hard in the chest. Turn, around, now. The man moved slowly, deliberately. Hands placed flat on the hood, fingers spread, no sudden motions. Anyone watching would have thought he was complying completely. But the officer didn't notice the details, the angle of the stance, the spacing of the feet, the way the man's shoulders relaxed instead of tensing. The officer moved in close. Too close, crowding him, pressing dominance where distance would have been safer. You like playing calm, the officer muttered. Let's see how calm you are in cuffs. He grabbed the man's wrist roughly and yanked it back. That's when the man spoke again, softly, almost regretfully. Don't do that. The officer scoffed. Or what? The answer didn't come in words. The man shifted his weight just slightly. The officer felt it before he understood it. balance, slipping. What the man didn't strike, didn't punch, didn't kick, he redirected. A twist of the wrist, a step inside the officer's space, a subtle movement that turned force against itself. The officer stumbled forward half a step, catching himself awkwardly. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The officer yanked his arm free. "What did you just do?" he shouted. The man turned his head enough to look at him. "I asked you not to," he said. Now the officer was angry, not performative anger, but real. Embarrassed, exposed. His voice rose. "Step away from the vehicle, now." Backup crackled faintly over the radio at his shoulder, but he ignored it. The crowd could feel it. This had gone past procedure. One man whispered, "This is bad." A woman shook her head. "That cop's losing it." The officer shoved the man again, harder this time, trying to reassert control. "You don't touch me," he barked. "You don't move unless I say." He reached again. This time, the man didn't warn him. He turned. Smooth, controlled, catching the officer's arm mid-motion. The movement was so fast, some people blinked and missed it. The officer's grip was suddenly gone. Pain shot up his arm. Hey. The man released him immediately and stepped back, palms open. "Stop," the man said firmly. "This is your last chance to de-escalate." The word hung in the air, de-escalate. The crowd murmured. The officer stared at him now, eyes wide with disbelief. "You just assaulted an officer," he snarled. "You're going down." He reached for his radio. That's when a voice cut through the tension. "Hold up." An older man had stepped forward from the edge of the crowd. Gray hair, worn jacket, eyes sharp with recognition. He squinted at the calm man under the lights. "I know you." The officer turned sharply. "Sir, step back." But the older man didn't. "That's Steven Seagal," he said slowly, like saying it out loud made it real. A ripple of shock moved through the crowd. "No way. Seriously. The martial arts guy." The officer froze just for a second. "Who?" he said. The man at the car exhaled quietly. "Yes," he said. "That's my name." Steven Seagal. The officer stared at him, disbelief mixing with rage. "I don't care who you are," he said louder now. "You think that changes anything?" Steven met his eyes. "It changes what happens next," he said. And somewhere in the distance, sirens began to rise. The sirens were distant at first, just a faint echo bouncing between buildings, easy to ignore if you didn't know what they meant. But everyone there felt it. That sound wasn't rushing toward the scene yet. It was warning it. The officer heard it too. His jaw tightened. His hand hovered near his belt, not committing, not retreating. The crowd had gone completely silent now, as if speaking might make things worse. "You don't move," the officer barked, louder than before. "You don't breathe unless I tell you." Steven didn't respond immediately. He stood with his hands open, relaxed at his sides. Posture neutral. Not submissive, not aggressive, balanced. "Officer," he said evenly. "You're escalating something you can't control." The officer scoffed, but the sound lacked confidence now. "You already assaulted me," he said. "You think a name fixes that?" Steven shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "But your next move will decide how this ends." That was the sentence that broke the officer. To him, it sounded like defiance. To everyone else, it sounded like fact. The officer lunged forward, grabbing Steven's shoulder and shoving him hard toward the hood of the cruiser. Down. The motion was fast, aggressive, sloppy. Steven moved, not explosively, not dramatically, precisely. He shifted his weight off the line of force, letting the shove pass through empty space. The officer overextended, momentum carrying him forward. Before he could recover, Steven's hand closed around the officer's wrist. Not squeezing, just anchoring. The officer tried to pull back. He couldn't. Steven rotated his arm just enough to lock the joint. Pain flashed instantly, sharp and unfamiliar. "What are you doing?" the officer shouted, panic creeping into his voice. Steven stepped inside the officer's balance point. The crowd gasped as the officer's feet left the ground. Not thrown, not slammed, but lifted and redirected. In a fluid motion, Steven guided the officer forward, using the car as a pivot. The officer went up, then over, The world seemed to pause for half a second as his body rotated. Then gravity finished the conversation. The officer landed awkwardly, momentum carrying him into a position he couldn't escape. One leg tangled, the other lifted by his own movement. He ended up suspended, inverted, pinned by leverage and geometry, rather than brute force. Upside down, alive, uninjured, completely helpless. The crowd erupted, gasps, shouts, disbelief crashing all at once. Oh my God, how did he do that? Is that even real? Steven held him there without strain, breathing steady. The officer struggled instinctively. The worst thing he could have done. Stop moving, Steven said firmly. You're making it worse. The officer froze, fear replacing anger. I can't, he stammered. I can't feel my arm. You can, Steven replied calmly. And you will, if you stay still. The sirens were louder now, closer. Steven looked around at the crowd. Everyone step back, he said. Give him space. And people listened. That alone said everything. The officer's radio crackled frantically, his voice breaking as he tried to speak into it upside down. Officer needs assistance. Steven leaned in just enough for the officer to hear him clearly. I told you to call your supervisor, he said quietly. This didn't need to happen. Tears welled in the officer's eyes, not from pain, but from realization. I didn't know, he whispered. I didn't know who you were. Steven's voice didn't change. That doesn't matter. Red and blue lights flooded the street as multiple cruisers screeched to a halt. Doors flew open. Officers rushed forward, then stopped cold. No one moved because what they saw didn't make sense. One officer hanging upside down, another man holding him there calmly. A crowd watching in stunned silence. A senior officer stepped forward slowly, eyes narrowing as he took it in. Sir, he said carefully, release him. Steven met his gaze. I will, he said. Right now. He guided the officer back down gently, easing the pressure until the man collapsed onto his knees, shaking but unharmed. The senior officer stared at Steven, recognition dawning. Sir. Steven nodded once. Yes, he said. Steven Seagal. The street stayed silent, because everyone there understood something now. This wasn't about strength. It wasn't about power. It was about control, and the cost of losing it. The street didn't explode into chaos the way movies pretend it does. It went quiet, too quiet. Red and blue lights washed over the pavement, bouncing off shop windows and parked cars. Doors of patrol cars stood open. Several officers had their hands near their belts, not drawing weapons, not relaxing either. Everyone was thinking the same thing. How did this get so far? The officer who had been upside down sat on the curb now, shaking. His cap lay a few feet away, forgotten. One hand clutched his arm protectively, testing it, relieved to find it still worked. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked small. The senior officer stepped forward, slow and deliberate. He was older, grayer, the kind of presence that didn't need volume. All right, he said calmly. Everyone breathe. No one argued. He looked first at the shaken officer on the curb. You hurt? He asked. No, sir, the officer replied, voice unsteady. I don't think so. The senior officer nodded once, then turned his attention to the man standing calmly a few steps away. For a long moment he studied him, posture, expression, stillness. Then recognition clicked. His shoulders stiffened slightly. Sir, he said again, this time with clarity. Steven nodded, polite but distant. Yes. A murmur rippled through the crowd again. Phones lowered now. People weren't recording for shock anymore. They were watching history settle into place. The senior officer removed his hat. Sir, he said, choosing his words carefully, I'm Captain Reynolds. I want to apologize for how this situation was handled. Steven didn't answer right away. He looked past the captain, at the shaken officer, at the onlookers, at the bartender still standing in the doorway. This wasn't about me, Steven said finally. It was about restraint. Captain Reynolds exhaled slowly. Yes, sir. He turned sharply to the officer on the curb. Stand up. The officer struggled to his feet, eyes down. "You violated procedure," the captain said evenly. "You escalated a compliant stop. You used force without cause, and you ignored a direct suggestion to call supervision." The officer swallowed hard. "I didn't know who he was," he said weakly. Captain Reynolds' voice hardened. "That's not a defense. That's the problem." The crowd leaned in without moving closer. "This job," the captain continued, "doesn't come with the right to humiliate people. Authority without discipline is liability." The officer nodded, tears slipping free now. "Yes, sir." "Turn in your weapon," the captain said. The words landed heavier than handcuffs ever could. The officer hesitated, then complied, unclipping it and handing it over. "You're suspended effective immediately," the captain continued. "Internal affairs will take it from here." The officer looked up then, at Steven. "I'm sorry," he said, voice breaking. "I shouldn't have touched you." Steven met his gaze. "You shouldn't have touched anyone like that," he replied calmly. "Learn from this." No anger. An ambulance arrived, lights flashing softly. Paramedics approached, but Steven waved them off. "He's fine," Steven said, "just shaken." Captain Reynolds nodded appreciatively. He turned back to Steven. "Sir," he said, lowering his voice, "we'll need a statement." Steven considered for a moment. "You already have witnesses," he said, "and video." He gestured gently to the crowd. "This will speak for itself." Captain Reynolds gave a tight nod. "Yes, sir." As officers began dispersing the scene, the crowd slowly exhaled. Conversations resumed, quieter now, reflective. "That cop really messed up," someone murmured. Men stayed calm the whole time. "I didn't even recognize him at first." Steven adjusted his jacket. As he turned to leave, the older man who had recognized him earlier stepped forward. "Sir," he said respectfully, "thank you for not making it worse." Steven paused. "That choice was his long before tonight," he replied. "I just stopped it from continuing." He walked away down the sidewalk, lights fading behind him. Captain Reynolds watched him go, then looked back at his officers. "Remember this," he said quietly. "Power isn't proven by force, it's proven by control." The street returned to normal, but no one who was there forgot what they saw. Because that night wasn't about a celebrity. It was about what happens when authority meets ego, and ego loses. By morning, the street looked ordinary again. The skid marks were gone. The flashing lights were replaced by sunrise. The crowd had dispersed back into their routines. But the moment didn't disappear. Stories like this never do. They live in quiet places, in the memory of the officer who sat alone in a small room answering hard questions, in the phones of strangers who replayed the footage, not for entertainment anymore, but for understanding, in the thoughts of people who wondered how close things had come to ending very differently, and in the man who walked away without raising his voice. Steven Seagal didn't give interviews that night, didn't post anything, didn't turn it into a victory. He went home, because for him, it wasn't a performance. It was a reminder. Power is loud when it's insecure. Control is quiet when it's real. The officer had believed authority meant dominance, that the badge gave him permission to intimidate, to humiliate, to escalate, and for a moment, no one stopped him. Not procedure, not the crowd, not even his own instincts. Until he crossed a line and learned that force, when used without discipline, eventually meets something stronger. Not anger. Not revenge. Restraint. That's the part people miss. The most dangerous thing in that street wasn't a martial artist's skill. It wasn't technique or strength or reputation. It was calm. Calm is what allows someone to think clearly when everyone else is reacting. Calm is what prevents a bad moment from becoming a tragedy. Calm is what separates those who carry power from those who merely borrow it. The crowd learned something that night too. They saw how quickly authority can slip into abuse, and how rare it is for someone to stop it without turning it into chaos. They saw that compliance doesn't always protect you, and aggression doesn't always win. Most of all, they saw that respect has nothing to do with uniforms, titles, or fame. It has everything to do with how you treat people when you think you're in control. The officer lost more than his shift that night. He lost the illusion that power makes you untouchable. And maybe, if he was willing to learn, he gained something more valuable. Perspective. Because consequences aren't just punishment. Sometimes, they're instruction. Steven never said, "I'm famous." Never said, "I train police." Never said, "You shouldn't have touched me." He didn't need to. The lesson spoke for itself. That's why it stayed with people. Not because a cop was humiliated, not because someone was flipped upside down, but because the situation stopped before it turned irreversible. No shots fired, no hospital beds, no names added to headlines that begin with another. Just a moment where ego met discipline, and discipline held the line. That's the part worth remembering. Because every day, in quieter ways, the same test happens in offices, on roads, behind counters, online. Someone who has power, even briefly, and someone else is at their mercy. What happens next depends on character. The story isn't really about Steven Seagal. It's about what he represented in that moment. A choice to escalate, or to control, to humiliate, or to stop, to prove dominance, or to demonstrate restraint. True strength isn't what you can do to someone. It's what you choose not to do when you could. And that's why. Long after the sirens faded, the lesson stayed, because everyone who saw it knew the truth. The calmest person in the room often holds the most power, and the ones who forget that learn the hardest way. Weeks passed. The incident slowly slipped out of headlines and feeds, replaced by the next outrage, the next argument, the next distraction. That's how it always goes. The world moves on quickly, even from moments that once felt seismic, but for some people, time didn't erase it. For the officer, the memory followed him everywhere, in quiet rooms, in sleepless nights, in the echo of a slap that should never have happened, and the silence that followed it. Training manuals suddenly read differently. Words like de-escalation and restraint no longer felt theoretical. They felt personal. For the crowd that night, the story became something they told differently each time. Not louder, not prouder, just slower, more thoughtful. "I was there," some would say. "I saw how calm he was. It could have gone so wrong." They didn't talk about techniques, they talked about stillness, about how fear drained out of the street the moment control entered it. And for Steven Seagal, life went on as it always had. No press conference, no lawsuit, no victory lap. That choice mattered more than people realized. Because legacy isn't built in moments of dominance. It's built in moments of restraint. Anion can escalate. Anion can humiliate. Anion can turn power into a performance. But it takes discipline to stop. That night didn't become a legend because someone was flipped upside down. It became a lesson because it ended. No sirens racing to hospitals. No families getting phone calls. No irreversible mistakes made in seconds of ego. Just a line drawn and respected. That's why the story lingered. Not as gossip, as warning. Authority is temporary. Control is earned. The officer had power because of a badge. Steven had control because of years spent learning when not to act. That difference matters. It always has. Every generation learns it the hard way. Through moments when someone forgets the responsibility that comes with authority. Through situations where force is easier than patience, where ego speaks louder than judgment. But every once in a while, there's a moment where things go the other way. Where someone chooses not to win, but to stop the fight from happening at all. Those moments don't trend as easily. They don't make heroes or villains, they make examples. The real ending of the story isn't about one officer or one man. It's about the quiet truth that settled over everyone who witnessed it. Respect isn't demanded. It's demonstrated. Not when cameras are rolling, not when names are known, but when pressure is high and choices still exist. The calmest person didn't shout, didn't threaten, didn't claim importance. He simply refused to lose control, even when provoked. And that refusal changed the outcome for everyone. That's the legacy, not fear, not dominance, but discipline. Because true strength isn't proven by what you can do to another person. It's proven by what you stop yourself from doing. Long after the street returned to normal, long after the uniforms changed shifts and the crowd went home, that lesson remained quiet, uncomfortable, undeniable. Power reveals character. Pressure exposes it. And in that moment, under flashing lights, character mattered more than authority ever could. That's why the story still gets told. Not as a flex, not as a myth, but as a reminder. Choose restraint. Choose respect. Choose control. Because one moment of ego can follow you forever, but one moment of discipline can stop everything from going wrong. And that's a legacy worth leaving. If you believe humility is real strength, type respect. If you've ever seen Calm Stop Chaos, you already understand why this story matters.